At my son's wedding, my seat wasn't missing. It was replaced with a trash can, and somehow, everyone else seemed to think that was funny. I remember standing there for a moment longer than I should have, holding my purse in both hands, staring at the small white card taped neatly to the rim, my name written in elegant calligraphy as if that made it appropriate, as if that made it acceptable. And then I heard her voice behind me, light and careless. "Oh, Margaret, don't look so serious. It's just a joke." And I turned to see Ashley smiling, that polished, picture-perfect smile she wore for everyone else, the same smile she used when she wanted to make something cruel sound harmless. And for a second, I considered saying something. Just one sentence, something simple like, "This isn't funny." But I didn't. I simply nodded, the way I had learned to do over the years, the way you do when you realize speaking won't change anything. And I set my purse down and took the seat they had prepared for me, the plastic lid slightly unsteady beneath my weight, the faint scent of cleaning chemicals rising up, as if to remind me exactly what they thought of me. And around me the reception carried on as though nothing was wrong. Glasses clinking, soft laughter floating through the room, music playing just loud enough to fill the silence that no one wanted to acknowledge. And I could feel the glances, subtle at first, then less so, people looking, then looking away, unsure whether to react or pretend they hadn't noticed. And I helped them by pretending too. I adjusted my dress, folded my hands in my lap, and kept my eyes on the table in front of me, as if everything was exactly as it should be, as if this was just another seat, just another moment in a perfectly normal evening. And when Daniel walked past me, my son, my only son, he didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. He just gave a small, awkward smile, the kind you give a stranger when you don't want to get involved. And in that instant, something inside me didn't break. It didn't shatter the way people describe in stories. It simply went quiet, like a door closing. In a house you've lived in your whole life, a sound so soft you almost miss it. And I realized then that this wasn't about a joke. It wasn't about a misplaced seat or a poorly chosen prank. It was something much simpler and much colder than that. It was a message, and I had received it loud and clear. And the surprising thing wasn't how much it hurt. It was how little I reacted, because I had already seen this kind of thing before, not exactly like this, not quite so bold, but close enough that I recognized the pattern, the careful way respect had been chipped away piece by piece, the quiet exclusions, the subtle dismissals, the decisions made without me, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and sitting there on that ridiculous seat they had chosen for me, I found myself thinking not about what they had done, but about what I already knew about the conversation I had less than 24 hours earlier, about the documents I had signed with steady hands, about the way the attorney had looked at me, waiting for hesitation that never came. And for the first time that evening, I had allowed myself the smallest smile, not the polite one I had worn for years, but something quieter, something they didn't notice, because while they were busy laughing, while they were busy believing they had reduced me to something disposable, they had no idea that I hadn't come to this wedding just to sit at their table. I had come to finish something they had started. And unlike their little joke, I never did anything without meaning it. I stayed there longer than anyone expected me to, long enough for the music to shift from soft piano to something brighter, long enough for the servers to begin circulating trays of champagne, long enough for the room to settle back into its rhythm, as if what had happened had already been absorbed and dismissed. And I played my part carefully, nodding when spoken to, offering small, polite smiles, answering questions with the same measured tone I had used my entire life, because that is what they expected from me. That is what they had always relied on, my ability to smooth things over, to make discomfort disappear, to protect the illusion of a happy family, even when the truth sat right in front of everyone. And as I sat there, I began to notice things more clearly than I ever had before. The way Ashley moved through the room like she owned it, greeting guests, adjusting details, whispering instructions to the wedding planner with the confidence of someone who believed she was already in control of everything. And Daniel followed her lead without question, laughing when she laughed, nodding when she spoke, his attention never once drifting back to me unless someone else drew his focus in my direction. And even then it was brief, surface level, as if acknowledging me was a task he needed to complete quickly before returning to what mattered more. And I realized then that this moment, this small, deliberate humiliation was not an isolated act. It was the final version of something that had been developing for years, something I'd chosen not to fully see, because seeing it would have required me to accept a truth I was not ready to face. That I had slowly been moved out of my own family without ever being told directly, replace not. In one sudden action, but in a series of quiet decisions, each one small enough to excuse on its own, but together forming something undeniable. And as that understanding settled in, it did not bring the kind of sharp pain I might have expected. It brought clarity, a calmness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I had finally stopped trying to hold together something that had already come apart. And I reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a slow sip, grounding myself in the present moment while my mind moved briefly to the day before, to the office with its neutral walls and steady air conditioning, to the sound of papers sliding across a polished desk, to the careful way each sentence had been explained to me, not rushed, not softened, just stated plainly. And I remembered how I had listened without interruption, how I had asked the questions that mattered, how I had signed my name without hesitation, because by that point, I already understood what needed to be done. And sitting there now, surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing the quiet acceptance of an older woman who did not know any better, I felt something shift fully into place inside me. Not anger, not even resentment, but a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that simply waits for the right moment. And when Ashley passed by my table again, leaning down slightly, as if to check on me, her voice still carrying that same light tone, asking if everything was all right, I looked up at her and met her eyes directly, holding her gaze just a second longer than she expected, and I said yes, everything was perfectly fine, and for the briefest moment, something in her expression flickered, something uncertain, something she quickly covered with another smile before moving on, and I watched her go, noting the way she did not look back because she did not think she needed to, and that was when I understood that the advantage I had was not in what I would say, but in what I already knew, because while they believed this evening belonged to them, they had no idea it was already slipping out of their hands. The speeches began just as the sun dipped low enough to cast that warm golden light through the tall windows, the kind of light people always describe as perfect, as if the entire day had been designed for photographs and memories that would last forever. And I watched as guests turned their chairs toward the center of the room, their attention shifting naturally toward the small stage where Daniel stood with a glass in his hand, his posture confident, his voice steady as he thanked everyone for coming, speaking about love and new beginnings in a way that sounded practiced, almost rehearsed, and I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to the tone beneath them, the distance I could hear even when he spoke about family. And when he finally mentioned me, it was brief, a single sentence about how much he appreciated everything I had done for him growing up, delivered with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The kind of acknowledgement that feels more like an obligation than a truth. And the room responded with soft applause, the kind people offer without thinking too deeply about what they are applauding. And then Ashley stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm before she took the microphone, her voice bright and warm as she thanked her own family, her friends, the people who had supported her. And when she spoke about building a future, she spoke as though that future had already been carefully arranged, every piece already in place, and I noticed how easily she filled the space, how naturally she commanded attention. And as she spoke, I shifted slightly in my seat, feeling again the unsteady surface beneath me, a quiet reminder of exactly where I had been placed in all of this. And then it happened, not in a grand or obvious way, but in the kind of small, careless moment people assume no one important will notice. Ashley leaned slightly toward one of her bridesmaids, her voice lowered but not enough, and she said something that carried just far enough for me to hear, something about how everything would finally be easier now, how there would be no more interference, and the word she used next was light, almost playful, but it landed with precision. She called me unnecessary, and there was a soft laugh in response, quick and dismissive, as if the idea itself was obvious. And I sat there, completely still, letting the words settle, not reacting, not turning, not giving any sign that I had heard it, because in that moment I understood something important. This was not just about disrespect. It was about removal, about rewriting the structure of the family in a way that no longer included me. And the clarity of it was almost striking because it confirmed everything I'd already begun to suspect, everything that had led me to that quiet office the day before. And as the applause rose again at the end of her speech, filling the room with energy and celebration, I brought my hands together gently, joining in just enough to blend into the sound, my expression calm, composed, exactly what they expected to see, and yet beneath that surface, every detail was aligning, every assumption they had made about me, every calculation they believed was working in their favor. And I realized that what they saw as the final step in pushing me aside was actually something else entirely. It was the moment that made everything irreversible, the moment that ensured there would be no misunderstanding later, no room for excuses or explanations, because I had heard it clearly, I'd seen it plainly, and now there was nothing left to question, only something left to do. For a long time after the applause faded, I did not move. I simply sat there with my hands resting lightly in my lap, feeling the quiet hum of the room as conversations resumed and chairs shifted back into place, and my mind drifted not forward but backward, not to yesterday or last week, but to years that now felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had believed that effort and love would always be recognized in the end. And I saw Daniel as a little boy again, sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out. In front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration while I stood at the stove making dinner after a long day at work. The house small but warm, every corner filled with the kind of life that comes from trying your best, even when things are not easy. And I remember the nights I stayed up late balancing bills, making sure everything was paid on time. The mornings I woke up early to pack his lunch before heading out the door. The weekends spent driving him to games, sitting on hard bleachers, under the hot sun or the cold wind, cheering just a little louder than everyone else, because I wanted him to know he was never alone. And I remember the day he left for college, how proud I'd been, how I had stood in that empty doorway afterward, telling myself that all of it had been worth it, every sacrifice, every compromise, every quiet moment where I chose his future over my own comfort. And then I saw the years that followed, the gradual shift that I had explained away at the time, the calls that became shorter, the visits that became less frequent, the conversations that felt more like updates than connections. And when Ashley entered his life, I had welcomed her without hesitation. I had set an extra place at the table, offered help without being asked, made space for her in ways that felt natural to me. Because that is what you do when your family grows. You adjust, you support, you step back just enough to let new bonds form. But somewhere along the way, that step back had turned into something else, something I had not fully named until now. And sitting there, listening to the low murmur of voices around me, I understood that every moment I had once seen, as generosity had been reinterpreted as permission to take more space, to make more decisions, to slowly shift the center of everything away from me until I was no longer part of it at all. And the realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of quiet acceptance, not of what they had done, but of what it meant, because it meant that the role I had been holding on to no longer existed, not in the way I believed it did, and that clarity felt heavier than any single act of disrespect, heavier even than the chair I was sitting on, because it forced me to see the entire picture at once, not just the moment in front of me, but the path that had led here. And as I lifted my gaze and looked around the room again at the decorations, the flowers, the carefully arranged tables, I realized that everything about this day had been designed to celebrate a beginning. But for me, it marked something else entirely. Not an ending filled with grief or regret, but a conclusion that had been forming quietly for years, one that I had finally reached with complete understanding. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to question it, no need to fix it, no need to explain it away. I simply acknowledged it for what it was. And in that acknowledgement, something inside me settled in a place with a calm certainty that did not ask for approval or recognition. It only asked for action. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly as it was supposed to, at least on the surface. Dinner was served in carefully timed courses. Laughter rose and fell in polite waves, and the kind of conversations that fill rooms like this continued without interruption. But I no longer followed any of it closely. Instead, I began to watch with a different kind of attention, not focused on what was being said, but on what was being revealed in the spaces between words. And it did not take long before I saw it clearly, the pattern that had been forming long before this day, now playing out in small, almost invisible moments that no one else seemed to notice, like the way Ashley gently redirected a guest who asked where I was seated, her answer light but dismissive, as if my presence was something minor, something easily overlooked, or the way she spoke about future plans with such certainty, mentioning changes to the house, adjustments to living arrangements, all framed as practical decisions that had already been agreed upon, even though I had never been part of those conversations. And I listened as Daniel responded with quiet agreement, not questioning, not clarifying, simply accepting each statement as if it had always been understood. And in those moments, I realized that the future they were describing had been built without me long before this evening, that what I was witnessing now was not the beginning of their intentions, but the continuation of something already in motion. And I thought back to smaller instances that I had once dismissed, like the time Ashley insisted on handling my mail while I was away, explaining it as a convenience, or the way certain documents had been moved from one place to another without my knowledge. Each incident subtle enough to explain away on its own, but together forming a pattern that was no longer possible to ignore. And I understood then that the conversation I had in that quiet office had not come too early. It had come just in time, because what they saw as careful planning was built on one critical assumption, that I was unaware, that I would continue to remain passive, that I would accept whatever role they assigned to me without question, and that assumption was the only thing they had truly miscalculated. And as that realization settled in, I felt no urgency, no need to rush toward what I would do next, because timing, I had learned, was far more powerful than reaction, and rushing would only diminish the clarity of what needed to happen. So instead, I continued to sit there, composed and quiet, allowing the evening to progress exactly as they intended, because every word they spoke, every plan they casually revealed, only strengthened what I already knew. And when I finally rose from my seat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm composure I had carried throughout the night, no one immediately noticed, which felt fitting in its own way, and I adjusted my jacket, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and took a single step away from the table, not as someone being pushed aside, but as someone choosing where to stand next. And in that moment, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was preparing for what I would do in return, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of a quiet certainty that had finally replaced every doubt I once carried. I walked slowly along the edge of the reception hall, not toward the exit, not yet, but toward the quieter part of the room where the large windows overlooked the garden, the evening air pressing softly against the glass. And for a moment, I stood there, watching the reflection of the celebration behind me instead of turning around to face it directly. Because sometimes it is easier to see things clearly when you are not standing in the middle of them. And in that reflection, I saw Ashley moving from table to table, her gestures confident, her laughter easy, and Daniel close beside her, just slightly behind, as if he had already accepted his place in the life she was building. And I noticed how natural it all looked from a distance. How convincing. The kind of image people would remember later when they spoke about what a beautiful wedding it had been. And I let that thought settle for a moment before I reached into my purse and felt the edge of the folded paper inside, smooth and firm, exactly where I had placed it earlier that day, and I did not take it out yet. I only let my fingers rest against it briefly, a quiet reminder that everything I needed was already in my possession, everything that had been discussed, reviewed, and finalized with careful precision. And I thought again of the attorney's office, of the way he had paused before handing me the final document, giving me one last opportunity to reconsider, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the weight of the decision. And I had met his eyes calmly and told him there was nothing to reconsider, because by that point the decision had already been made, not in that office, but over years of watching, of understanding, of finally accepting what had been right in front of me all along. And now, standing here with the soft music still drifting through the room behind me, I understood that there was no need to rush what would come next because the power of a moment like this does not come from urgency. It comes from timing, from allowing everything to align exactly as it should. And I turned slightly, just enough to see the head table again, the place where I'd been seated earlier, now empty, unnoticed, already blending back into the arrangement of the room as if it had never held any significance at all. And I felt a quiet sense of completion in that observation, not sadness, not regret, just a clear acknowledgement that the role they had assigned to me had already been erased in their minds. And that made what I was about to do not only justified, but necessary. And as I stepped away from the window and began to walk back toward the center of the room, I did so with the same steady pace, the same composed expression, blending seamlessly into the movement of guests who had no reason to pay me any special attention. Because to them, I was still exactly what I had appeared to be all evening, a quiet presence, someone easily overlooked, someone who would sit, smile, and leave without causing any disruption. And that assumption, more than anything else, was what made the next moment possible, because it meant that when I finally reached the place where all eyes would naturally turn, when I chose to speak not loudly but clearly, not with emotion but with certainty, it would not be expected, it would not be prepared for, and in that brief space between what they believed and what was about to happen, everything would shift in a way none of them had considered. And I took one final breath, not to steady myself, because I was already steady, but simply to mark the moment, the quiet point where observation ended and action began. The moment did not announce itself with silence or sudden attention. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, as the music softened and one of the groomsmen tapped his glass to signal another round of toasts, and I stepped forward at the same time, not interrupting, not forcing my way into the space, but simply placing myself where I could be seen, where I could be heard without raising my voice. And for a second or two, no one reacted, because there was no reason for them to. I had given them no reason all evening to expect anything different from me. And then someone closest to me noticed a subtle shift in posture, a slight turn of the head, and that small movement began to ripple outward, one table at a time, until the attention of the room adjusted just enough for my presence to register. And Daniel looked at me then, his expression confused, not concerned, just mildly surprised, as if I had stepped slightly out of place in a way that did not yet seem important, and Ashley followed his gaze, her smile still in place. Though I could see the brief calculation in her eyes, the quick assessment of whether this was something she needed to manage, and I met that look without hesitation, not challenging, not aggressive, simply steady. And when I spoke, I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room had already quieted enough for my words to carry, and I began not with accusation, not with explanation, but with something simple, something that fit the tone of the evening. I said that I wanted to offer a few words as well, that I appreciated being part of such an important day, and there were a few nods, a few polite smiles, the kind people give when they expect something predictable, something safe, and I allowed that expectation to settle before I continued. And then I spoke about time, about how quickly it passes, how families grow and change, how roles shift in ways that are not always spoken out loud. And as I spoke, I kept my tone calm, reflective, giving nothing away except the words themselves. And I saw people listening more closely now, sensing that there was something beneath what I was saying, something just out of reach, and Daniel shifted slightly, his attention sharpening, while Ashley's smile began to tighten at the edges, and I let a brief pause fall in the room, not long, just enough to hold their focus, and then I reached into my purse and took out the folded document, holding it lightly in my hand, not displaying it yet, just making its presence known. And I said that earlier that week. I had taken the time to review certain matters that had been left open for too long, matters that concern my future, my home, and the way things would be handled moving forward. And now the room was completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from instruction but from instinct, and I continued in the same measured tone, explaining that I had made decisions, clear and final decisions, to ensure that everything I had built over the years would be managed in a way that reflected not just obligation, but respect. And I did not look at anyone in particular when I said it. I did not need to, because the meaning was already understood. And when I finally unfolded the paper, the sound of it was soft but distinct in the quiet room. And for the first time that evening, I saw something change completely, not in me because I had already changed, but in them, in the way their certainty began to falter, in the way the assumptions they had relied on started to slip. And I held that moment exactly where it was, not rushing past it, not filling it with unnecessary words. Because sometimes the most powerful shift happens not in what is said next, but in the realization that something has already been set in motion that cannot be undone. No one spoke after that. Not immediately. The room held its breath in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if every person present understood that something had shifted, but no one was entirely sure how far it would go. And I let that silence remain for a moment longer before continuing, not to fill the space, but to guide it, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about clarity, and I explained in the same calm tone that the document I was holding was not something impulsive or emotional. It was the result of careful consideration, of time spent reviewing what had been said, what had been done, and what had been implied over the past few years. And I spoke about responsibility, about the difference between being included and being assumed, about how easily respect can be replaced with convenience when no one chooses to question it. And as I spoke, I could see it settling across the room, not in dramatic reactions, but in subtle shifts, people straightening in there. Chairs exchanging brief glances, beginning to understand that this was not a misunderstanding, not a moment that could be laughed off or dismissed. And then I stated it plainly, that as of that afternoon, every arrangement concerning my home, my finances, and anything tied to my name had been formally updated, that control and ownership would no longer pass automatically to anyone based on assumption or proximity, but would instead follow terms that had been clearly defined and legally secured. And I did not rush through those words. I let each one land exactly as it was meant to, measured and precise. And when I finally looked directly at Daniel, it was not with accusation. It was with a calm acknowledgement of reality. And I said that this was not about punishment. It was about understanding, about ensuring that what I'd spent a lifetime building would not be reduced to something taken for granted. And Ashley moved slightly then, her composure tightening, her voice beginning to rise as if to respond, to question, to regain control of the moment. But she stopped before she could fully speak, because she understood something at the same time everyone else did. That this was not a conversation open for negotiation. It was a conclusion already reached, and I continued without raising my voice, explaining that decisions made quietly over time often reveal more than words spoken in public, and that I had simply chosen to respond in the same manner, with the same level of thought and intention. And I folded the document once more, not to hide it, but because I no longer needed to display it. Its presence had already served its purpose. And in the stillness that followed, the atmosphere of the room had changed completely. The easy laughter from earlier replaced with a kind of careful awareness. And I could see it clearly now, not just in Daniel or Ashley, but in everyone present, the realization that what they had witnessed as a small moment of disrespect had led to something far more significant, something irreversible. And I allowed that understanding to settle fully before I took a single step back, not retreating, not withdrawing, but simply creating space, because the moment no longer required anything more from me. It belonged now to what had already been set in motion. And as I stood there calm and composed, I knew that whatever they had expected from me at the beginning of the evening, this had never been part of it, and that was precisely why it mattered. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something settling after being disturbed. And the first sound came not from the center of the room, but from the edges, a quiet murmur, a chair moving slightly, a glass being set down with more care than before. And I remained where I was, not filling that space, not correcting it, because there was nothing left for me to explain, and Daniel was the first to step forward, not with confidence, but with a kind of uncertainty that did not suit him. His voice lower than it had been earlier, asking what I meant, asking why I had not discussed this with him beforehand. And I looked at him calmly, not avoiding his question, but not rushing to answer it either, because the answer was already clear in everything that had led to this moment. And when I did speak, I kept my tone even, reminding him that discussions require participation, that decisions shared require presence, and that over time, both of those things had quietly disappeared, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of choices that had been made without me. And I saw the shift in his expression then, not understanding fully, but beginning to recognize the truth in what I was saying, and Ashley stepped in quickly, her voice sharper now, no longer softened by politeness, suggesting that this was not the right time, that this could have been handled privately, that I was creating unnecessary discomfort, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her words to finish, because interruption would only suggest emotion, and I had none left to give in that way. And when she was done, I responded simply that privacy had been an option long before tonight, that respect had been an option as well, and that both had been set aside without hesitation. And I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room was already quiet enough that every word carried clearly, and I could see now that the control she had held earlier in the evening was slipping, not dramatically, but in small, visible ways. The tightening of her posture, the way her eyes moved quickly as if searching for support that was no longer as certain as it had been before, and around us, the guests who had once been relaxed and engaged were now watching more closely, not with judgment, but with attention, the kind that comes when something real replaces something staged. And I did not turn to them. I did not address them directly, because this was not about an audience. It was about clarity, and I took a step back again, not retreating, but creating a boundary, a clear separation between what had been and what would follow. And I said that nothing I had done was meant to disrupt the evening, that everything had already been completed before I arrived, and that what remained now was simply acknowledgement, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement of a decision that had already been made. And I could see it then, in both of them, the realization settling in fully, not just that things had changed, but that they could not be changed back, that whatever expectations they had carried into this day no longer applied. And I held that moment steady, not pressing further, not adding anything unnecessary, because the weight of what had already been said was enough. And in that quiet, measured space, the balance of the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through conflict, but through something far more difficult to challenge, a calm certainty that did not need to argue in order to be understood. No one rushed to speak after that, not even Ashley, who only moments ago had seemed so certain of how this evening would unfold, and I could see it now in the way she held herself, still composed on the surface, but no longer in control of the direction things were taking. And Daniel stood there as if caught between two versions of reality, one he had expected and one he had not prepared for. And for a brief moment, I allowed the silence to remain untouched, because it was doing something words could not. It was forcing them to sit with what had already been said, to feel the weight of it without distraction. And then I spoke again, not to extend the moment, but to complete it, to ensure there would be no misunderstanding left behind. And I explained that the decisions I had made were not sudden, not influenced by a single evening or a single action, but shaped by time, by observation, by a growing awareness that certain expectations had quietly replaced communication, and that what had once been a relationship built on mutual care had shifted into something unbalanced, something assumed rather than valued. And I said this without accusation, without raising my voice, because I did not need to convince anyone of anything. The truth had already revealed itself in ways that could not be denied, and I clarified that the arrangements now in place were designed to protect what I had built, to ensure that it would be managed responsibly, and that access to it would no longer be based on proximity or entitlement, but on conditions that reflected respect and accountability. And as I spoke, I could see the effect settling across the room, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, the kind of shift that changes how people look at each other, how they understand what they are witnessing. And Ashley's expression tightened further, her attempt to maintain composure becoming more deliberate, more controlled, as if she were trying to regain footing that was no longer there. And Daniel's confusion deepened into something quieter, something more reflective, as if he were beginning to trace back through moments he had not questioned before. I did not interrupt that process. I did not rush to fill it with more explanation, because understanding does not come from being told what to think. It comes from recognizing what has already been done, and I folded my hands lightly in front of me, not as a gesture of closure, but as a sign that I had nothing more to add, that everything necessary had already been said, and the room remained still for another moment before the first small movements began again. A guest shifting in their chair, someone taking a careful sip from their glass, the soft sound of music continuing in the background as if it had never stopped, and I realized then that the evening would continue, that people would return to their conversations, that the structure of the event would carry on as planned. But something essential had changed, something that could not be reversed or ignored. And I stepped back once more, not withdrawing, but simply allowing the space to return to them, because what had needed to happen had already taken place, and there was no further role for me to play in the performance they had prepared. And as I turned slightly, preparing to leave the center of the room, I did so without hesitation, without looking for approval or reaction, because the moment I had chosen had already passed, and what remained now belonged entirely to the consequences they would have to face, not in some distant future, but beginning with the quiet realization settling over them in that very room. As I stepped away from the center of the room, I did not rush. I did not look back immediately. I simply moved at the same steady pace I had carried throughout the evening, allowing the space behind me to fill with whatever reactions would come. And it did not take long for those reactions to surface, not in loud confrontations or dramatic outbursts, but in quieter, more revealing ways, the kind that say more than raised voices ever could. And I could hear it in the shifting tone of the room. The conversations that had once been light now lowered, measured, careful, as if every word needed to be chosen more deliberately. And when I reached the edge of the reception area, I paused briefly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to observe one last time without being part of it. And I turned slightly, just enough to see them clearly, Daniel standing in place, no longer speaking, his posture uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not yet understand. And Ashley beside him, her expression controlled but strained, her attention moving quickly from one guest to another, trying to reestablish the rhythm of the evening, trying to restore something that could not simply be put back the way it was. And I noticed how some of the guests avoided meeting her eyes now, not out of judgment, but out of discomfort, the kind that comes when a situation reveals more than people expected to see, and others watched more openly, their expressions thoughtful, as if reassessing what they had witnessed from the beginning, connecting moments that had seemed insignificant before. And I realized then that what had happened would not remain contained within this room, not because I intended it to spread, but because clarity has a way of moving beyond the moment in which it appears. And I felt no need to control that, no need to manage how it would be interpreted, because the truth did not require adjustment. It would carry itself in whatever direction it needed to go. And as I continued walking, I passed by tables where conversations had resumed, but with a different tone, a different awareness, and I understood that the image of the evening had already changed, not erased, but altered in a way that could not be undone. And when I reached the hallway leading toward the exit, the music softened behind me, becoming distant, almost indistinct. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to exhale fully, not out of relief, but out of completion, because there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left waiting to be addressed. And I thought briefly of the years that had led here, of the moments I had overlooked, the things I had chosen not to confront, and I recognized that this was not a sudden ending. It was the natural result of everything that had come before, and as I stepped toward the door, I did so without hesitation, without looking back again, because I did not need to see their reactions a second time. I had already seen enough, and whatever they chose to do next, whatever conversations they would have, whatever explanations they might attempt to create, none of it would change what had already been said in emotion. And as I moved out into the cool evening air, leaving the sound of the reception behind me, I felt something settle quietly within me. Not victory, not satisfaction, but something steadier, something more lasting, the kind of certainty that does not come from winning, but From finally understanding exactly where you stand and choosing, without doubt, to step forward from there. The air outside felt cooler than I expected. Not sharp, not uncomfortable, just enough to remind me that I had stepped into a different space. One that was no longer filled with expectations or quiet observations. And I paused for a moment near the edge of the walkway, looking out across the parking lot where rows of cars sat under the soft glow of overhead lights, each one belonging to someone still inside, still part of a night that would continue without me. And I did not feel the need to rush away from it. I did not feel the need to create distance as quickly as possible, because distance had already been established long before I walked through those doors. And as I stood there, I became aware of how quiet everything was compared to the reception behind me. The music now just a faint echo, the voices indistinct, reduced to something that no longer required my attention. And I reached into my purse again, not to check the document, not to confirm anything, but simply out of habit, the same small gesture I had made countless times before, and this time when my fingers touched the folded paper. It felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just settled, as if its purpose had already been fulfilled. And I thought about what would come next, not in terms of confrontation or explanation, but in terms of adjustment, because that was what this really was. Not a dramatic turning point, but a quiet realignment of what my life would look like moving forward. And I knew there would be conversations in the days ahead, questions that would be asked, attempts to revisit what had already been decided. But I also knew that none of those things would change the foundation that had been set, because the decision had not been made in response to a single moment. It had been built over time, reinforced by patterns that could no longer be ignored, and that made it steady in a way that did not require defense. And I took a few steps forward, moving toward my car, the sound of my shoes against the pavement steady and even, matching the rhythm I'd carried throughout the evening. And as I reached for the handle and opened the door, I paused just briefly before getting in, not to look back, but to acknowledge something quietly within myself. The recognition that I had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, not because I had lost something, but because I had finally stopped holding on to something that no longer existed in the way I once believed it did. And as I settled into the driver's seat and closed the door behind me, the outside world softened further. The faint sounds of the reception, now completely distant, replaced by the quiet interior of the car. And I placed my purse beside me, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel without turning the key just yet, allowing myself one final moment of stillness, not filled with doubt or second thoughts, but with clarity, the kind that comes when everything unnecessary has been stripped away. And in that moment, I understood that what I had done was not about changing them, not about forcing recognition or respect. It was about defining my own place with certainty, about choosing not to remain where I was no longer valued. And as I finally started the engine and the soft hum filled the space around me, I did so without hesitation, because there was nothing left behind that I needed to return to, only a path ahead that was now entirely my own. The road ahead was quiet as I pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights stretching across the pavement in a steady line. And for a while I drove without turning on the radio, without filling the space with anything unnecessary, because silence no longer felt heavy, it felt complete. And as the building behind me grew smaller in the rearview mirror, I did not focus on it. I did not measure how far I'd gone, because distance was no longer something I needed to calculate. It had already been established in ways that could not be reversed. And I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes forward, letting the rhythm of the drive settle into something calm and consistent. And I thought about how easily people mistake presence for permanence, how they assume that what has always been there will continue to remain, without ever considering the possibility that it might quietly step away, not in anger, not in protest, but in certainty. And I realized that was what had truly changed, not them, not the situation they had created, but my willingness to remain within it. Because for years I had adjusted, I had explained, I had accepted small shifts that eventually became something much larger. And tonight had simply brought that process into focus, not as a surprise, but as a conclusion. And as I turned onto a familiar road, the kind I had driven countless times before, I noticed how different it felt now. Not because the road had changed, but because I had, and that difference was subtle, not dramatic, but undeniable, like stepping into a space that looks the same, but no longer holds the same meaning. And I understood then that what I had done was not about taking something away from them. It was about taking something back for myself. Something that had never been meant to be negotiated or diminished. And as the miles passed, I did not replay the evening in my mind. I did not revisit each word or reaction, because there was no need to analyze what had already been understood. Instead, I allowed my thoughts to move forward, toward what would come next, toward the quiet mornings that would no longer be shaped by waiting for acknowledgement, toward decisions that would be made without hesitation or second-guessing. And I felt a sense of steadiness settle deeper within me. The kind that does not depend on anyone else's recognition, the kind that remains even when everything around it shifts. And when I finally reached the turn toward home, I slowed slightly, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because I knew that crossing that final stretch would mark something simple but important, not an ending, not a beginning, but a continuation on my own terms. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, the quiet returned once more, familiar and unforced, and I sat there for a moment, my hands resting loosely in my lap, looking straight ahead without needing to move immediately. And in that stillness, there was no doubt, no regret, no lingering question about whether I had done the right thing. There's only a clear understanding, calm and unwavering, that respect is not something you ask for. It is something you recognize when it is absent. And once you do, you no longer stay where it is not. Given, you simply stand up, step away, and let the silence say everything that words no longer need to explain.